Board of Directors and a docent here at Holocaust Museum, LA. I want to welcome everyone here and watching online to this evening's program, Building Bridges, Welcoming the Stranger. Our signature Building Bridges series brings together leaders from diverse communities for important town hall conversations about working towards common social justice goals. Tonight's discussion and our museum's work are more critical than ever given the state of today's world. The continuing war in Ukraine, global humanitarian and refugee crises, and the rise of hate rhetoric have led to an increasingly divisive social climate. California remains one of the states receiving the largest number of refugees, with Los Angeles County as a top destination. For those who are new to the Holocaust Museum LA, we are the first survivor-founded and oldest Holocaust museum in the country and home to the West Coast's largest collection of Holocaust-era artifacts. These are like tongue twisters. Admission is free for all students and for youth and under age 17. We also offer transportation grants for schools where field trips would otherwise be cost prohibitive. Our mission is grounded in teaching students and visitors the critical lessons and continued social relevance of the Holocaust, empowering them to stand up against hatred, bigotry, and anti-Semitism. We strive to build a culture rooted in kindness, tolerance, empathy, and treating people with respect. Since opening our permanent home here in Pan Pacific Park in 2010, we have welcomed nearly 600,000 visitors. To meet the need and demand for Holocaust education, we launched our Building Truth expansion plan to double the museum's footprint without losing any green space in the park. We will soon break ground on the new Jonah Goldbridge campus that will allow us to keep survivor voices alive, amplify our reach and impact, and increase our visibility. It is now my pleasure to introduce the moderator of today's program, Museum Board Member Dan Schnur. Dan is a professor at USC Annenberg School of Communications, UC Berkeley's Institute of Governmental Studies, and Pepperdine School of Public Policy. He currently presents a monthly webinar called Dan Schnur Political Report for the LA World Affairs Council Town Hall. As one of California's leading political strategists, Dan has worked on 4 presidential and 3 gubernatorial campaigns. Dan, thank you for helping us create the Building Bridges series and for serving as moderator today.
Well, thank you so much, Patsy. And thanks so much to all of you for joining us for our current conversation as part of this Building Bridges series, which I'm very flattered and very honored to have been a part of over the last couple of years. For those of you who are newer to our programming, I'll tell you that we began this series in the immediate aftermath of the tragic deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, coming up on almost 3 years ago now. And throughout the pandemic, we held these discussions online. And only in the last few months have we begun to in-person programming. And we're so, so grateful to have so many of you here with us today. The reason we do this programming is a logical outgrowth of one of the central principles that's guided this museum since its inception. When I first learned about the museum, what impressed me the most is not just the tremendous work that they do, that we do, to educate the Los Angeles community as to the horrors of the Holocaust, the lessons to be learned from it, and possible pathways forward. But what really impressed me is the determination, the insistence of the board and the staff to reach out beyond the Jewish community. And one of the things I'm proudest of that this organization does is the tremendous number of elementary school students, middle school students, and high school students that we bring to the museum from other underrepresented communities. And so young people, not just of the Jewish faith, but of any number of racial and ethnic and religious heritage can come and learn that there's lessons here for them too. And that there are ways for us to work together to do everything we can to keep these kind of horrors from happening again. Today's discussion, as Patsy mentioned, is on the subject of refugees. And what I will tell you, somewhat guiltily, is that this is a topic that I suspect, like many people, pay the most attention to during wartime and during other extraordinary time periods when refugees come to this country in unusually high numbers. But what I'm looking forward to hearing about tonight, and I think what you're going to really benefit from hearing, is of course that this isn't just a challenge, this isn't just a crisis that we face during the war in Ukraine, during the end of a war in Afghanistan. It's an ongoing challenge, it's an ongoing crisis. And I'm very, very privileged that the three individuals who joined me for today's panel are so knowledgeable and so steeped in knowledge of this issue, not from reading about it, not from thinking about it, but from doing really exemplary work in this field. And what I'm going to do, out of deference to them, is I'm going to ask each one of them to introduce themselves, to tell you a little bit, not just about the organization for which they work, but a little bit about them themselves, to get a sense for why they've decided to devote themselves to working in this critical field. So, with that, Anahita, I'm going to turn to you, and I'm going to ask you if you'd be willing to get us started. And then once each of our panelists has introduced themselves, we'll get into the more substantive discussion. The floor is yours.
Sure, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anahita Panahi. By profession, I am a refugee campaign manager with CHIRLA, the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights. We are based out of Los Angeles, and the organization was founded in 1986 to advance the civil rights of refugees and immigrants in the United States. We fight in the halls of Congress to ensure that refugees and immigrants that migrate to the U.S. Are brought here with dignity and are advocated for. And CHIRLA is actually one of the largest member-based organizations in California. But I will say that my start with this was really the lived experiences of my parents. My parents were actually also refugees who fled Iran after the 1979 revolution. And they actually fled and sought asylum in Copenhagen. And so Copenhagen is a very small Scandinavian city. And they really left their livelihoods and their families behind to be able to, create a better life for their children, my sister and myself. We were fortunate enough to migrate here in 2000, so about 23 years ago, and that just gave away my age. But really,
you're 23.
I'm 23, plus some change. But if it hadn't been for my parents' sacrifices that they made to flee their home country, then really I wouldn't have had the opportunity here today to speak about some of the most pressing humanitarian issues, specifically in the United States. So really looking forward to talk about some of the challenges that we're facing in terms of policy and what folks can actually do to help some of these policies advance, hopefully in 2023 and beyond. So thank you so much.
Anahita, thank you so much. Joe?
Hi everyone, I'm Joe Goldman, Community Engagement Director for the Western Region, which means California and Arizona at HIAS. HIAS was started about over 120 years ago as the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, created to help Jews who are fleeing pogroms in Eastern Europe. And we are now a global agency operating in 22 countries across 5 continents. And we are a proud Jewish agency serving people of all backgrounds. We like to say we helped refugees because they were Jewish, and today we help refugees because we are Jewish. And a lot of the work that I do, I actually do quite a bit with Anahita. We work in coalition together out here in California. But on my end, a lot of it is mobilizing the robust Jewish community. California and Arizona are collectively home to over a quarter of all American Jews. Please alert your friends in the Northeast in particular to that fact. We really punch above our weight, and it's a community that cares a lot about refugees and asylum seekers. And one of the things, especially being here in this museum, there are plenty of artifacts from folks who were resettled by HIAS, who had survived the Holocaust, the Shoah. And one of the reasons that I love doing this work is that even though much of my career has been at the nexus of the American Jewish community and politics, this work gets to the core of the American Jewish origin story. We as a community, although I'm not making any assumptions that everyone here is Jewish, but we as American Jews would not be here if not for refugee policy, and especially about a quarter of all American Jews would not be here if not for a lot of the refugee policies established in 1951, which I know I'm going to talk more about later. But it just really speaks to how much, no matter, even if this is the first time you're ever talking about refugees, especially if you are familiar at all or an ally to Jews, which you are if you are in this building, it really gets to the fact that the lives that we're able to live are so deeply enriched and empowered by welcoming the stranger.
Joe, thank you so much. Zoe, we're so glad to have you here.
I'm Zoe Winkler Reinis, and I am the co-founder of This Is About Humanity. We are a organization dedicated to raising awareness and funds for the families that have been separated at the border. We work in Los Angeles and in Tijuana. I started This Is About Humanity because I am a mom of 3, and in those families, I saw my children, and in the moms I saw myself, and the only thing that separated us was where we were born. And I was unaware that family separation had been going on for as long as it had, but when I saw it firsthand, you know, myself, I began to just be obsessed with it. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't stop thinking about those families. And so we started This Is About Humanity, and we work with 9 different shelters in Tijuana. We are partners with Yes We Can and Immigrant Defenders Law Center, and that's who we are.
Well, as you can see, we've got 3 experts here, so let's begin the conversation. And Joe, I want to start with you. And first of all, it's great to meet you in person, because for those of you who participated in some of our online programming, we've been fortunate to have Joe as a guest panelist in the past, so it's terrific to have you here in person. But Joe, I want to start with a point that Zoe made. The way I translated Zoe's point, just about the good fortune which we share, is the term I've always heard is, I won the birth lottery. And just simply have the good fortune of not being born into circumstances that allowed me to avoid the challenges that so many refugees face, but also in the right era. If I had been born at the time of my grandparents, I would have faced exactly the same kind of challenges. And just simply fortunate, just lucky that I didn't. But Joe, where I'd like to start with you is that even though many of our guests are not necessarily of the Jewish faith, we do try to reach out beyond. Given the work that you do at HIAS, I know you've developed some very strong feelings and some very strong insights about how this issue of refugee status is so deeply intertwined with the Jewish community and with our experience. And I wonder if you could start off by giving us a little bit of historical perspective on that question.
Thank you, and it is great to be here in person, and also hi to everyone online. As I alluded to just a few moments ago, the entire global refugee resettlement system as we know it was established in 1951 by the United Nations. And it's especially important to understand that most of the policies that were put forward for both establishing refugees and asylum seekers and as legal classifications, and I can define those in a second, those were written largely by Orthodox Jews who had survived the Holocaust. And the international community came together and said, never again do we want this to happen to other Jews and to anyone, where you are suddenly forced to be in a circumstance under which you cannot flee and seek safety elsewhere. And so, even though both the US, Israel, and many other countries have been signatories of that treaty, they have all failed to uphold their own obligations under that treaty. Otherwise, we would not be talking about family separations. We would not be here dealing with all kinds of issues. But it is absolutely core to Jewish safety and existence in the modern world over the last many decades that you wouldn't have had, especially sitting here in Los Angeles, Holocaust survivors, You wouldn't have the enormous Jewish community from Iran. You wouldn't have people from the Jews from the former Soviet Union, and also Israelis who were able to safely make aliyah from many corners of the world under this policy, who then came here as immigrants, not as refugees, but many of their parents and grandparents were refugees. And so I think one last piece to this, just understanding, because we use the term refugees and asylum seekers a lot. For a refugee is someone who has fled country A for country B. They register with the UN in country B. That's really critical to understand. They cross international borders, and if they are lucky, they will be resettled in country C. In the US and in most circumstances, they have to be invited to be resettled, and they go through lengthy background checks and so on that can sometimes take 1.5 to 2 years, which is kind of crazy because it's supposed to be a rescue program. Asylum, you're fleeing the same thing. Again, it's because of who you are, your personal background, your political views, your identity, but you are trying to exercise your legal right to seek asylum, seek refuge in a particular country. And so they are legally distinguishable things, but once you're granted asylum, which can take a very long time, you then can achieve a pathway to permanency in the US and elsewhere.
Joe, thank you so much. That's it's an excellent and a very fast overview of 70 years of refugee history, so we appreciate it. Anahita, I'm listening to Joe, and it reminds me of the famous quote that's often attributed to the American humorist Mark Twain, who reportedly said, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes." And I listened to Joe talking about the experiences from decades ago, and given the conversation that we've had, I know that while all sorts of things have changed over 3/4 of a century, a lot hasn't. And I'm wondering if you can give us a present-day overview of the type of policy challenges that you and your colleagues at CHIRLA work to confront.
Oh, there's so many, Dan. Where do I start? Well, let's start with the Federal Refugee Resettlement Program, which some of you may be familiar with. This was enacted in 1980, which is essentially a federal program that resettles refugees in the US, as Joe just mentioned, who are also vigorously vetted and take many, many years to be able to actually resettle here. The president assigns the number of refugees to be admitted into the United States each fiscal year. And so historically, we've resettled anywhere between 50,000 to up to 200,000 refugees per annual year. And that might sound like a lot, but I want to bring us to the actual reality of where we're at today and how we've gotten to where we're at today. This year, President Biden, in consultation with Congress, set the administration's presidential determination at 125,000 refugees. And so that news was very welcomed by immigrant and refugee advocates. Unfortunately, we are far behind the schedule that we need to be on to be able to admit 125,000 refugees. And so where we're at today is we've only resettled 10% of that number. And so that's only a little over 12,000 refugees for this fiscal year. And so our fiscal year ends this September, and so when that happens, we know that we must keep this administration accountable to resettle these refugees. So while we're retreating away from the traditional historic refugee resettlement program enacted by the federal administration, we are now seeing these humanitarian parolee programs for Afghans and Ukrainians, which I'll talk a little bit later about. But we're sort of moving away from the support of NGOs and the federal government to now US sponsorships for these refugees to come into the US. And what happens is that we have less support, less services, and we see a lot of refugee families now stuck in limbo as they're waiting to adjust their status. And so this is, again, in conjunction with a lot of the anti-asylum policies with respect to the border. One of these really important policies that has impacted immigration is Title 42. And so this health order, emergency health order, I should say, was enacted March 2020, so about 3 years ago to date, that has prevented asylum seekers from seeking safety at the border. Again, with the exceptions of Afghans and Ukrainians, and I'm sure Joe and Zoe can speak to that. And so with that being said, there is good news coming that on May 11th, Title 42 will be rescinded But unfortunately, again, as welcome as that news is, the Biden administration has now proposed an asylum transit ban. And so what does that mean? That means that they are going to continue denying asylum at the border. And so there are some efforts underway that we'll share a little bit later on how folks can get involved to ensure that their voice is heard and that asylum is granted to those who are seeking safety at the U.S. border.
Anahita, thank you so much. And I realize that was an unfairly short amount of time to cover a very, very broad area of public policy. So thank you very much. Zoe, I'm listening to Anahita, and it reminds me of something that I often tell my students at USC and at Cal as they're trying to figure out their next steps after graduation, particularly for those who want to engage in some kind of public service. And I tell them that there's two ways to make change. So you can make change wide, and you can make change deep. And one isn't any better or worse than the other. In fact, you need them both. Because if you want to make change wide, you work in public policy. And you affect large numbers of people, but from a distance. If you want to make change deep, you might affect the lives of a smaller number of people, but you affect those lives more deeply and in a much more profound way. And I'm struck in hearing your story that that's the path that you've chosen. So listening to Anahita talk about the real-world impact of these policy debates in Washington that we read about in the news media, I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about what you see every day in working with these individuals and these families as they're attempting to navigate this very difficult process.
So I think part of why we take these trips to the border, we take a bus full of people who want to learn and experience what is actually going on there. And the reason we do that is so you can bear witness to see these families, hear their stories, see the conditions in which they're living, and hear why they have to leave where they come from. And so I think that is the biggest part. You know, when Title 42 in 2020, they were able to scare everybody saying, you know, COVID, they're gonna bring COVID, they're gonna bring COVID. When actually, when we stopped going to Tijuana, it was because we didn't wanna give them COVID. We didn't wanna give these families living in the shelter, there was hardly any COVID there. So in the shelters that we were working with. And so people are able to use these broad and scary terms when actually I have not met a single frightening person, and I have been to the border over 47 times in the last 4 years. We work with families, we work with children who are unaccompanied minors. They come here by themselves. We work with the LGBTQ community there, which is, you know, if you are living your truth of who you are and you are LGBTQ, you probably won't survive. They wouldn't even rent us they wouldn't rent them a building to house the shelter. So we had to find a house, we bought the house, we paid the rent for 3 years. But I think it's really important to realize that these are human beings. When people use the word illegal alien, no human being is illegal. That just doesn't exist. And you never leave your home unless you have no other choice. Leaving your home with your children and your belongings in a backpack, that's not, you know, seeking luxury somewhere else. That's literally the only choice you have. So I think it's really important to remember that part, and that's why we, you know, decided on the name This Is About Humanity, because that's what it is. It's not about if you're a Democrat or a Republican. At this point, it's such a hot, you know, button issue who you align with. It's really just about these are children and mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters, and they deserve everything that we have. And so that's sort of the line that we all start from.
And it's such a critically important reminder for most of us who know this issue from what we read or what we watch or what we hear through the news media, that these policy debates come with faces and stories and the human beings. Just one quick follow-up before we go on with the next round of questions. Zoe, because you went past it fairly quickly, I wanted to make sure that everyone heard it. Did you say that you've been to the border 47 times in 4 years? I was really lousy at math, but that's once a month?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. I'm sure I'll think of an intelligent question to ask and follow up on that, but for right now I'll just say, oh my goodness. Anahita, I want to bring you back into this conversation because one of the things that you alluded to very briefly, and I know you feel strongly about it, I know it deserves much more consideration from the rest of us, is at the beginning of today's program, I mentioned how for many of us, a spike in refugees that occurs in extraordinary circumstances, war in Ukraine, war in Afghanistan, brings a much greater level of media and public attention to the issue. But from your perspective, not only is this an ongoing challenge and an ongoing crisis, but I feel like these wars in other parts of the world have made the work you and your colleagues do even more challenging and more difficult. Am I reading you right?
Yes. Yes. Thank you so much for that question, Dan. You know, and let's talk about Afghanistan and Ukraine because those are the two big recent humanitarian crises that we've seen and that has really impacted, you know, refugee arrivals around the globe. In particular to the U.S., I think we all saw the rapid response the federal administration took in response to admitting Afghans and Ukrainians. So with respect to Afghans, they introduced the Operation Allies Welcome program that provides humanitarian parolee status, which again is temporary for Afghans being paroled into the United States. I believe we resettled a little over 77,000. Correct me if I'm mistaken, these numbers are continuing to rise. And then with respect to Ukrainians, under the United for Ukraine program, similar program, again, humanitarian parolee status, which again is temporary. We've resettled a little over 117,000 to date. And again, as welcome as these rapid response humanitarian parolee programs are, what happens is that after a year to 2 year period when their parolee status expires, these individuals are actually left in limbo. And their sponsors don't have any more money, they don't have any more resources, and now they need to actually adjust their status. And so we have seen the retreat from the federal administration really impact these individuals that are being sponsored by individuals like yourself and my colleagues here, right? And we have limited resources in comparison to the federally funded refugee resettlement program. Another thing that we have really struggled with is understanding that the U.S. government is very much capable of resettling refugees, but prioritizing which countries they'd like to receive refugees from. And so we have seen, again, those that are coming from more white privileged countries being prioritized compared to our Black, brown, and indigenous brothers and sisters who are seeking asylum from the border. So we are really making sure that in our public narrative and messaging that we are inclusive because no human being is above another human being and that everyone is entitled to seek safety and refuge in the United States.
Anahita, thank you very much. And so I will come right back to you because it seems to me your work is directly impacted by the broader policy discussion that Anahita is talking about. So when you're at the border 47 times in 4 years, knowing that there's been a spike in the number of individuals and families looking to come, knowing that there is this fundamental imbalance in who is accepted and how and under what circumstances, how does that affect the work that you do, that you and your colleagues do every day, simply to help these families survive?
You know, there are families there that I've seen now at the same shelter for 2 years straight. And these are shelters that are usually basically a 30-day sort of place where you can figure out your next step. And so I think I actually am a sponsor for a family here that last August crossed. They're from Honduras and they are here on humanitarian parole. And I was saying to you when we spoke, you know, that the services that are offered to these families are so complicated. I am college educated, I speak this language, and I cannot figure it out. I couldn't figure out how to get them all the things that they are supposed to have. And so what's happening is the shelters are, you know, a shelter that would you'd normally have 100 people has 230 people. They are, you know, at one of the shelters we work with called Juventud, there's 1 tent per family. You could have 2 people in your family, you could have 6 people in your family, and you are given 1 tent. And another one that we work with, Caritas, it's one bed. So the shelters and the infrastructure there is not built to take care of all these people. I mean, in Tijuana, the budget to take care of refugees is, hardly anything. So it's just all of the resources are just thinner and thinner. We were able to open a kitchen, that This Is About Humanity relief kitchen. We took over when World Central Kitchen left in August. We took over their kitchen and we feed 3,000 people a day. But, I mean, that's scratching the surface, that's nothing.
So this is an untenable situation, and it's an unsustainable one. Joe, if I can, I'm going to ask you to broaden out the discussion again. And what I will say before I ask Joe the next question is the museum, as I think most of you know, is a nonprofit organization. We don't take sides in political or partisan debates. So what I say now is not as an advocate for any particular party or candidate, but just as an observer of the political process. Is, Joe, there was a widespread expectation after the 2020 election that some of these policy challenges might be addressed in a different way than they had been for the previous 4 years. I'm wondering if you can offer an assessment, again, not as a partisan, but someone who lives this every day. How has the Biden administration handled these issues, and how does that compare with the work of his predecessors?
It's been heartbreaking. It's been heartbreaking. Look, at HIAS, we're also in Tijuana. I'm actually leaving this exact event to go staff a delegation of rabbis in Florida who are going to be meeting with colleagues of ours in both San Diego and Tijuana. And not just at the US-Mexico border, where we have huge operations dealing with the failure of this administration on the asylum front. On the refugee front, it's a little better. But one of the things that I also wanted to point out in all the very important points that both Zoe and Anahita were making is that, first of all, for refugees are the only ones who can even qualify for government-subsidized case management support to help start new lives, and that's only for 90 days in most states. Some states subsidized to increase that higher. Asylum seekers get none of that. They get none of it. Now, some humanitarian parolees are eligible. Private sponsorship groups, they're on their own. As you heard, and so at HIAS we've had, and I'm going a little into the weeds to explain the bigger picture, because what the Biden administration is doing is recognizing, all these right-wing extremists are telling us, all these illegals are coming here, to get help from the government and take benefits away. Well, if we start, are getting benefits instead of, everyday Americans, which when anyone says that, they're talking about just white people. What is happening with the Biden administration is they are trying to, and again, I say this also as a nonpartisan, nonprofit, position, but they're trying to out-Republican the Republicans in certain ways in order to try to then protect other issues, like LGBTQ equality, access to abortion, and things like that. And frankly, look, I was at an event last week in Tucson with my CEO, and in front of 200 people. He just went and said, it would be wonderful if we could just do away with Fox News. But until that happens, we are facing a major uphill battle politically on an issue that had not been partisan until about 2015, when the Syrian refugee crisis began. Because that was the year that not only did a lot of people, especially in the American Jewish community, really wake up to the global refugee crisis that was happening, not just with Syrians, but people all over the world. But it was also the year that you had 31 US governors come out and say, we are not going to let any Muslim refugees move to our state. Now, they don't have the ability to actually enforce that, but it was in that moment that we started to see the hyper-politicization of this issue in ways that we've never seen before. The 1980 Refugee Act passed unanimously in Congress.
And of course, you can go back even further in this discussion about immigration policy. Not taking sides politically, it is worth noting that the last comprehensive immigration reform in this country passed in 1986 and was ultimately signed into law by President Ronald Reagan. So neither party has clean hands on this, is what you're telling us, Joe. And we
Correct.
have to be bipartisan in our concern.
Very.
I have monopolized this conversation long enough. Well, that's not true. I've monopolized this conversation almost long enough. And I really do want to get to my favorite part of these programs, which is to hear questions from as many of you as we're able to take on over the course of our remaining time. But if you'll all forgive me in advance, I have one more question I'd like to ask our three guests, because I think it's the most important question to put to them. Given the scope of the challenge that they've laid out for us, given the severity of the crisis that they described for us, the question I'm going to ask each to answer in turn is, what can we do? And Zoe, I'm going to start with you, because the story about how you got involved is so compelling and so extraordinary. For those of us who say, I don't have any real expertise in this area, I wouldn't really know what to do, what advice would you give to us clueless people who want to help anyway?
Well, I have no expertise or experience in this area, so I'm learning as I go. As I said before, I was a teacher for 12 years. I didn't say that, but I then was a stay-at-home mom of 3. One of my oldest is here. And
let's embarrass him just a little bit more.
And I had 0 experience in this area. I watched my mom and dad fight for what was right growing up and start organizations, but I really sort of was, focused on my family. And when I started seeing this and I couldn't let it go, I realized there's so many times in the day that we see something on the news or we hear something from a friend and we say to ourselves, oh my gosh, that's so horrible. And then it's too painful to continue thinking about it, so we just switch gears and sort of get to our to-do list. And what I would say is that if I can, build this organization with the help of our incredible volunteers, it's 3 of us, we have no board, we have no team, it's me and my 2 incredible partners, that anyone can do it. And so what I encourage people to do is ask the questions, go visit, go talk to a friend about it, so that when you're sitting at a dinner party or you're sitting with a family member, you can say that you've seen firsthand what's going on, or that you've listened to somebody who has, or talking about it, I think, is such an important thing, and realizing that it's never too small. Anything you do is enough, but you have to do something.
Boy, and I have to say, although I'm excited to hear your answer, I'd anticipated much of it, but there was one thing you said that I hadn't thought about that really struck me. I talk in my political advocacy classes about biographical credibility. That once you've experienced something, once you've accomplished something, you have the ability to talk to people in a much more credible manner than you would otherwise. And Zoe, I hadn't thought about your point, but if I sit at a dinner or a gathering and say, I read this really troubling article, well, people might say, oh yeah, that's too bad. But if I can say, I looked that child in the eye, it's an entirely different impact. And so I'm so glad, along with the other advice you gave us, that you raised that in particular. Anahita, I'm going to come to you now, because in addition to that kind of in-person, face-to-face assistance that Zoe's talking about, I'll go back to the idea of making change wide. And for those of us who want to help and do want to get involved at the community level, but might, for whatever the reason, find that helping with policy and advocacy might be somewhere we can make a contribution to, what kind of opportunities are there for us in that regard?
Yes, definitely. If I may, I'm going to start at the local level, jump up to state, at the national level. I'll be quick, I promise. So at the local level in Los Angeles, I am honored to be the vice chair of the Refugee Forum of Los Angeles, which is a forum of LA-based refugee resettlement agencies. We work with the county, the mayor's office, and do quarterly reports on refugee arrivals and services for refugees. So we are tasked with organizing the World Refugee Day celebration in Los Angeles on June 20th. This is really a moment to connect with refugees and newcomers as we celebrate them on World Refugee Day. So my card is out there. If you'd like to be on the listserv, we will share out these events. So that's some opportunities to get involved at the local level. At the state and national level, there are opportunities to meet with our state legislators and members of Congress who again pass policies to ensure that this country can become more welcoming for refugees and newcomers. So next month we will be both in Sacramento with some of our colleagues and then also in DC to advocate for many of these pro-refugee and immigrant policies, including holding the administration accountable to resettling the number of refugees to be admitted, including the Afghan Adjustment Act to ensure that Afghans can actually adjust their status after their temporary protected status is expired essentially. And so these are also opportunities for the public at large to get involved. These are actually free of charge if you are in the area or if you can fly up to Sacramento or even join virtual visits in DC with members of Congress. We provide the training, we schedule the visits, and you will have a group leader to have you meet with your state senator or assembly member when it comes to advocating for these pro-refugee policies. So really just want to emphasize that we need to educate our policymakers to ensure that this country can become more welcoming.
And I'm just going to second Anahita's point. As somebody who worked in politics for many years before I fled to academia, for those of you who have not advocated before a member of the City Council or the state legislature or the United States Congress, it can sound, when it's being described, it can sound a little intimidating. Let me tell you this. They're not any smarter than we are. They're just more shameless. And what I will tell you is how much elected officials of both parties, of all ideologies, benefit, not just from hearing from paid professionals, no offense to our panel, because as smart and as talented as they are, somewhere in the back of that politician's mind is the fact that, well, they get paid to be here.
Not me.
Which is why it's always even more important. But for all of you, for all of us, when they know you're doing this not because it's your profession, because it's something that you care about, not because it's your vocation, because it's your avocation, that has an impact, even with the most clueless of them. And I know enough about CHIRLA to know how effective they are, and even getting those who are new to this thing, to get you to a point where you can be very, very comfortable. And if, as you consider whether or not to do this, you think, well, it sounds uncomfortable, it sounds a little bit difficult, think back to what Zoe was saying earlier about the people who she works with every day, and think that talking to a member of Congress really isn't that uncomfortable by comparison. Joe, I'm going to wrap up this portion of the program where we started. And obviously, for all of us, getting involved in some way or other is of critical importance. But given where we sit today, it seems to me that there's a special resonance and a special import for the Jewish community to become involved. And I'm wondering if, before we go to our audience's much smarter and much better questions, if you'd be willing to tell us a little bit about whether there's a specific role for the Jewish community in this effort.
Absolutely. And like Anahita, I'm actually going to break it down state, national, and one international plug. At the state level, I hope that you will join in either going with Anahita's groups or join HIAS at JPAC Capital Summit in Sacramento, May 9th and 10th. The Jewish Public Affairs Committee of California. We will be lobbying on SB 85, which was introduced by the co-chair of the California Legislative Jewish Caucus, Senator Scott Wiener. And that bill would double the length of time that refugees in the state have access to case management. So while California, unfortunately, cannot set its own immigration policy in terms of who gets in, we have a very big role to play in terms of how those people are welcomed. And I can tell you, as I mentioned, it's not just whether or not a governor says something mean and nasty about refugees, but the state level policies do have a huge impact on residents. We see that domestically. It also means for those who are newcomers. So it's a huge opportunity for us, especially in the Jewish community, to stand up. The Jewish community is playing a huge role in this particular bill. And so I really hope that you will join us then.
And if you decide that you want to take that JPAC trip to Sacramento, let me know after the program. I'll get you the information, and I'll see you there.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm glad you'll be there. And also I'm happy to help with that. Tomorrow is the deadline to lobby the Biden administration against the asylum ban. if you go to HIAS.org and fill out the action form, we will get your comments submitted. You have to submit your own unique comment. It's a unique form of administrative advocacy. Some of you may be somewhat familiar to that when you had the same political party controlling the White House between 2016 and 2018. And so it's really important that we get those in, even though it is likely going to come into place. The more we show wall-to-wall opposition, it demonstrates that there's key support for asylum seekers. And then the last piece, look, even though at HIAS we operate in many, many countries around the world, we helped build the state of Israel. We resettled millions of Jewish refugees there, and right now there is a huge political upheaval where the current coalition is seeking to gut judicial independence, which would likely destroy what is left of its democracy if they succeed. And I know this is a very difficult subject for a lot of American Jews to wrap their heads around, and how much we say we do or do not discuss it. HIAS, in addition to having resettled millions of Jews there, we also represent 30,000 asylum seekers, predominantly from Eritrea and Sudan, who literally walked there seeking safety and refuge from either genocide or oppressive regimes. Eritrea is the North Korea of Africa. And they are all, the only way we've ever been able to seek redress for these populations is through Israel's courts. And if judicial independence is gutted, we are risking seeing all 30,000 face en masse deportation, along with their 10,000 children, who are all born in Israel, speak Hebrew, and are probably more Israeli than almost anyone in this room. And so there are a lot of great organizations out there that need support in addition to HIAS Israel. But I do encourage you, we have great partners at places like Darkenu, as well as the New Israel Fund, which has a lot of grantees, which were the first to start mobilizing protests against this assault on democracy.
And if you wonder why Joe's talking so fast, it's because I told the panelists they only had a few minutes to answer each question, so he has a lot of information to get in. So at this point, I'd like to turn to what's my favorite part of the program. When our audience members, when you have the chance to question our panelists. I'll ask you the same thing that I ask my students on the first day of each semester, which is that when you ask a question, if you can tell us your name and your major, and if there's anybody in particular on the panel to whom you'd like to address the question, or alternatively, if it's something you'd like each of them to take on. One last request. One of the things that I've learned is that those who attend our panels are very, very smart, very, very, very well-read people. And over the years, I've learned to remind people that their question should be a question and not a statement. That doesn't usually go so well. So if you feel compelled to make a statement, just put a question mark at the end and we'll all pretend it will be just fine, okay? So with that, who would like to into this conversation? Let me give you...
My name is Henry. Drama was my major. I'm very proud of our daughter. And I would love to ask you, this country that talks about independence, and if you will, it is not a dream, are they willing to just let their judicial system go into the dust?
Joe, I believe that one's directed
So, as we speak, there are hundreds of thousands, at least, about 2 hours ago, there were 600,000 people in the streets.
There's 700,000.
700,000, thank you. 700,000 out of a country of 9 million. Out in the streets, it's now like 3 in the morning because Netanyahu decided to fire his defense minister, who publicly came out against his own judicial reforms, or judicial coup, depending on your angle on it. And so there are people fighting for this very reason, for fighting against it. And I will say, as someone who's been to Israel 8 times in the last 14 years, not as impressive as going to the border, though, 47 times. It is a lot closer. But to what Dan was saying about the, being there and seeing it with your own eyes, it is incredible to see the inspired outrage among a lot of people who had become so cynical and so skeptical and had given up on a vision of a more just and pluralistic and democratic Israel. And so I know Israel is not the main focus of this conversation, and I try to avoid bringing it in. It's just, you given this is a huge earthquake in the Jewish world that is happening right now as we speak, that has enormous consequences for refugees and asylum seekers.
And I will say this, though it's not on topic also, and for anyone who'd like to stay around afterwards, I know Joe and I suspect Zoe and Anahita will be happy to have the conversation about Israel, but I will offer this. My own beliefs as someone who's spent some time on this is that Netanyahu, despite his action with the defense minister, is going to cut a compromise on this. He got what he wanted. Last week, the Knesset passed a bill that makes it much more difficult to remove a prime minister from office. And I suspect now that he's been able to achieve that, a compromise on this issue is something he's much more willing to accept. Longer conversation for afterwards. Let's get back to refugees. Ma'am?
Hi, my name is Stacy. I'm Zoe's mother. And
Anyone who's not related to
I
Zoe?
don't mean this to be about Zoe, but it's something that really concerns me because I worked with abandoned and abused children and was part of establishing, a big part of the establishment of a children's service department many, many, many years ago in Los Angeles County. And I get nervous because in a better world, we should be able to write our congressman, talk to people in Sacramento, talk to people in Washington. But the truth, what I have found to be the truth, is that money seems to be the only thing that will make most of those people listen and abide by what they promised before they were elected. And it becomes so frustrating to work within the system and so painful and such a dead end that I personally have experienced. And I would love, if it could be true, to do it properly through the proper channels, but I think it's more good disruption is the only thing that changes things. The only way we were able to make changes in children were by finding famous people or people who could get on the news and humiliate our board of supervisors at the time. It wasn't going through the proper channels because we got no answer going through proper channels.
Well, you're laughing, but is what she's saying true? Is
It
there
feels
truth
really
to it?
true, and I would like to know, you all seem to be extremely proactive. And for someone who wants a return, for someone who wants to, as we always say, make a difference, but a real difference, and not just write letters to people who are essentially not paying a whit of attention to them. How do we really make a difference except by disruption, except by boots on the ground, doing the work at the border, or it's so frustrating now. I don't know how to make an inroad to make people listen and to behave responsibly and to do what is just in this world. It seems like everything is political and everything is a lie. And I am an utter and complete cynic at this point, and I desperately would rather not be.
So the first thing I'll do is I want to thank you for the extraordinary work that you've done on a critically important issue over the course of your career. But I am going to come to the panel. I always like to say that politics is too important to be left to the politicians.
Yeah.
And while you're exactly right, the campaign contributions and extremely well-known people playing a role can make a difference. I'm going to start with you, because the work that CHIRLA does is specifically designed not to replace the type of things that we're talking about here, but to augment them and push them forward.
Yeah, I definitely hear you. One of the things that CHIRLA does is, and what's unique, is that it is a member-based organization. And so what that means is that individuals that are members are typically impacted individuals. So we are talking about undocumented, DACA recipients, refugees, who are then invited to actually participate in protests and advocacy legislative visits with our state legislators. But one thing that I see some shaking of the heads, one thing I want to talk about is agitation. In the model of organizing, we talk about agitation, is being able to, when we educate and have one-on-one conversations, maybe with our friends and family members and colleagues, is being able to identify what their self-interest is in this and being able to agitate that action. And so by that, what we mean is being able to get them to participate in, throwing down in protests. We have done, and this is an example for DACA recipients, what CHIRLA had done was held rallies all the way leading from California to DC. And so those sometimes are the types of actions that we need to see on the ground to be able to wake up members of Congress, whether it comes to camping out of Congress for several days in the cold. Again, it's the agitation and self-interest that has brought them there. And so I hear you, and I agree. Politics is dirty, simply put. We have to still educate our lawmakers. We have to get at the forefront of it, but making sure that we don't lose sight of organizing our community members who are directly impacted as well.
I'd like to add to this, because the cynicism is absolutely warranted. I have degrees in political communication and political management. This is like my bread and butter. And politics has always been everywhere all the time, even when we didn't realize it, right? We hear the term office politics, right? That's just one great example. Literally, it's not just politics that's partisan, but politics is everywhere because we're people. But I will say, look, we got a bill, Anahita and I actually got, it eventually just became part of the state budget, and instead of going through the rest of the FACACTA system in our state level, but basically it was this bill, AB 1368, which allowed for the state to subsidize for case management for people granted asylum. We didn't get celebrities going out there, naming and shaming people. It was one of these things where it was a lot of coalition building, a lot of meetings with elected officials. In this case it was Zooms, because it was still, not everyone was vaccinated yet, but it was a whole drawn out but typical way that things do happen. And we're seeing this again. I feel really great so far about SB 85, even though the budget this year is going to be tough. But look, we have people like Equality California backing this bill because they know it will help LGBTQ newcomers who come to the state. And we have more and more city and local governments, city and county governments, because guess what? It's going to save them money. And so, the money equation is in there. It is there. But I think it's really, really easy, given the terrifying situations we're seeing ourselves in right now as a country here on our own democracy, and even, let alone, all the issues that we care about in our day-to-day lives, to feel like at the end of the day it's not enough. And I understand that. And one thing that got me out of my, hardest, lowest ruts in this work is embracing the idea of harm reduction. Because the reality is there are millions of people in this country that is the only option they've ever had when it came to their politics, and especially among Black Americans. And so I think that's something that, even for me as someone who has not had that lived experience, it has taught me a whole lot of how to get through this work every day.
Okay. I think the question you raised is such an important one. And Jen, it's probably the type of thing that ought to be the subject for a full program rather than a few minutes at the end.
It's the apathy
Of course,
within the country.
And I empathize with you as someone who worked in politics for many years. I was a cynic. I call myself a born-again ingenue. I started out optimistic, I went cynical, and came all the way back around because I get to work with people like these. I'll offer one quick piece of advice, and then we'll go on for a couple more questions before we raise. Next year's an election year in California. And I know two things about politicians. I know that they don't listen that much after they've been elected. They listen a lot more before they've been elected. And there's a campaign for US Senate here in California next year. And the three leading candidates, when they're asked about these issues, are going to recite the exact same talking points to you. But when you go to see them, when you go to hear them, ask them these questions and listen not just to words that they recite, but take a measure of that man and those women and decide for yourself which one isn't just happen to be on the right side of these issues, but is willing to work side by side with Zoe and Joe and Anahita to move the ball forward. Because once they get elected, they're a lot harder to reach. Other questions? Yes, back here.
I'm Cara. My question is a little granular. Sure. My question is a little granular. Can you talk a little bit about the kids in the equation and the education journey in particular, and what happens to a refugee versus an asylum seeker in this country, and what happens, that 10% number was really astounding to me. What can I mean, I don't even know what the question is, but can you sort of explain what that journey looks like for families? Because we know that education provides sort of the freedom, right, to stand on your own 2 feet. Also, the mental health services that are now baked into education because of the mental health crisis that we're facing in this country, and for sure, the refugees and asylum seekers face.
So, Zoe, you had talked about the various challenges that a family faces when they arrive here, and reminded us that the journey here, sadly, is often the easy part. I wonder, one of those many challenges is making sure that children get the education they deserve. Can you talk a little bit about what you've seen for parents who want their kids to get that education and the challenges involved?
So the work that we do is mainly in Tijuana. So once the families come here, aside from the family that I am sponsoring, that is left up to our partners. But I will say that you guys can probably speak better to that piece. But in Tijuana, in Mexico, it's illegal to go to school unless you have your papers. And many of these families don't have their papers, which is why we helped, yes, we can open a mobile schoolhouse in Tijuana next to one of the shelters.
The one thing I will add is the Los Angeles Unified School District has students who speak over 100 languages. And so one of the greatest challenges that LAUSD faces is making sure that those kids can not only sit in school, but can actually benefit from the time that they spend there. What I'll tell you is that as they move through the system, this gets back to a point that Joe made about state level work. And Joe, Anahita, I don't know if you want to talk at all about the remarkable work that the state of California has done about making higher education available to young people who lack documentation. Because it's a process that goes all the way through. Some of the most amazing students I have in both of my classes do not have documentation. And for all sorts of reasons, the challenges are about to get even more difficult for them. Joe?
Well, I want to make one really important distinction. The work that HIAS is doing, the work that Zoe's been doing, and this is about humanity, is not really about undocumented folks at all. That is a huge population that deserves lots of dignity, humanity, and respect. Those are folks who came here, with their parents who are undocumented, were not necessarily asylum seekers. Some of them may have been people who sought asylum and then lost their case and then stayed. Oh, you do? I'm sorry. That is my mistake. But I think it's, and a lot of people understandably mix a lot of these populations up together, which in colloquial conversation isn't that big of a deal, but in the policy world and the political world, there are huge differences. And there are a lot of wonderful organizations that are fighting to change some of that dynamic because it's ridiculous. It is about humanity. And I think that that's one piece. On the education side, look, with LA, especially LA County, we have 10 million people. We're probably the most diverse place on the planet. And it is, it is to our benefit that we have newcomers. Our population hasn't grown that much because we need to build a lot more housing. Feeds into a lot of local stuff. But, so you do see, a lot of programs, newcomer programs at places like LA Unified. But I will say, I know that there, what I've heard from places, this is just LA Unified alone, and maybe things have started to change, but, kids have to miss school to get the newcomers support before they can then just sit in school and be getting that help, right? So there's still a lot of work that has to be done. But a refugee their family is getting some support from case managers at a social service agency that makes sure that if the family moves because their temporary housing changed and they're in a more permanent place, that the kids can either go to the same school or they get the help that they need to be in a new place. If they're an asylum seeker, tough luck.
So we have time for another question or two, but the good news is, whether they realize it or not, Zoe and Joe and Anahita are more than happy to stay around for a short amount of time after the program is concluded to answer any questions that we don't get to. If it were up to me, we'd go 7 or 8 hours. Patsy gets mad at me when I do that. So let's make this our last question of the day.
We're friends of Zoe. What I wanted to say is we're a product of the system. We were Mexican Jews, and we came here through an amnesty program, and we're very happy that we got the opportunity to live in this amazing country. But my question to you is, what has been done, or what do you guys think could be done in the educational system to let the kids know make them aware of all these things that are happening with refugees, with asylums, that they can start working from a short age, or when they start growing up, they can start thinking about how they can be much more proactive into these issues. Because I think everything starts with education, and I think that would be great to be able to involve it in that same way.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you for that question. And so I'm actually going to refer back to the Refugee Forum of Los Angeles, because LAUSD is actually part of that forum as well, and there are distinct programs for newcomer children, for refugee children, undocumented programs, DACA programs, you name it, those programs exist. And so what we really pride ourselves in is making sure that there's education in everything. And so we do partner with LAUSD, with the CSU system, to be able to conduct workshops, educational ceremonies. So we've done a few at USC as well. And so depending on the population, this is something that we want to hear from the public. What is needed? Are the kids at an appropriate age to hear about the realities of what we're facing in terms of immigration, how they can better integrate newcomers in the classroom to make sure that they're feeling welcome. And from my experience as someone that lived in Europe and travels often to Europe, we see systems in place after the Ukrainian humanitarian crisis that actually works to welcome these Ukrainians. So trying to ensure that we're not asking them to assimilate right away, but rather integrate. And so that's a really big distinction when we talk about integration, because we want to ensure that they can still bring their culture, their values, their beliefs as they're integrating here. So we can absolutely, bring these and pose these ideas to the LAUSD to see, what more informative, fun sessions that we can bring to the children, definitely.
I've been granted permission to allow one last question before we wrap up. There's a very insistent young woman in the back of the room who wanted to weigh in.
Hi, my name is Maria Alejandra. I'm a refugee, I'm a political scientist, and I moved here 10 months ago from Guatemala. And the reason why I'm here is actually because there has been going on big setbacks in democracy in my country. I used to work at a UN agency, and we achieved great success fighting against corruption and impunity, and after that I decided to move on and also become an advocate for women's rights and children's rights. And that led me to be attacked by government. All my family was attacked. We were just threatened by precisely and personally by the president. So I decided to sue him, and that's the reason why I'm here. I was, as Joe explained, I received a call and they told me if I wanted to seek asylum here, or if I wanted to apply for the process to become a refugee here. And after, even though it takes 1 year to 1.5 years, 2 years, it took me 4 months. And after 10 days, they asked me to leave my country. So I am here, but lots of my friends and lots of people in Guatemala, and I will say rest of Central America and Latin America are right now victims of what we can call a new era Cold War, where narratives are just consuming basically all the efforts of government just to position ideas, to make governments basically dictatorships all around Latin America, Central America. It has become the home for human rights violations, and I think it's important to create awareness about that. And I just want to ask you, how are you listening to the refugees' experiences, and how many refugees are on these panels speaking about their experiences and the reasons that brought them here? Because I think it's also important, very important, that we hear or we learn from their experiences. And they can give you so much information about what is going on in their countries, and maybe that can lead to build some policies that can put the government attention into what's going on there and maybe prevent them to running for their lives and getting here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. A question for anyone who'd like to take it on, but I think it's a really, really important one. We talked earlier about biographical credibility, and of course the only thing more credible and more experiential than working directly with an individual or family who's gone through this sort of ordeal is hearing the story of those individuals and families themselves. Question, how do you integrate those stories into your work?
I'll be brief. You know, in the work that we do, I'm welcome to the United States first. I'm so glad that you're here and you're safe. In the work that we do, we put a very large emphasis on including lived experiences. And so I do want to be clear is we're not asking them to join us just to share their stories, but we actually include them in policy decision making when we meet with elected officials. We want elected officials in particular to hear from those individuals that are impacted and have these lived experiences. And so you know, we, of course, do community events. We always want to make sure that we have individuals with lived experiences. So I promise you for World Refugee Day in Los Angeles, we will definitely have that representation and would love to connect afterwards.
Yeah, it's really important having impacted voices in our work. And you know, one of the things that I'm often doing even within HIAS, because millions of our original clients were resettled generations ago, including some of my own ancestors. The latest they arrived here was 1907. However, especially in a city like Los Angeles, you know, where I mentioned kind of at the top of the conversation, not only do you have Holocaust survivors, you have all these folks who have come from Iran, the former Soviet Union, and those are just some of the more recent Jewish clients we've had, let alone, you know, many thousands of others from around the world. And having those people involved in a conversation is extremely important in shaping policy. I second Anahita, and I'm really relieved that you're here. We should talk because HIAS has offices in Guatemala. But it's really the global fight for democracy, whether the whole conversation we had about Israel earlier, here in the United States, what we're seeing unfold throughout Latin America and the Caribbean, it just shows how intersected all of this is. And so I really appreciate what you're doing, and I'm grateful you're here.
Right. So we've gone a little bit over, and it doesn't appear by the looks on the faces in the room that was a mistake. And I'm guessing if we could, we'd continue this conversation longer. And for those of you who'd like, I know our panelists, jokes aside, would be happy to stay around a little bit longer and answer any questions that you didn't have a chance to pose as part of the formal program. But I will say this, the last question that I asked, as I mentioned earlier, I felt was the most important one, which is what can we do? And the one thing I heard from many people, as is often the case when we're taking on seemingly insurmountable challenges, is how frustrating it can get, and how cynical we can get. Years ago, the late Steve Jobs gave a famous commencement speech at Stanford University. And in that speech, he talked about the importance, and I quote, because I love this line, he talked about the importance of putting a dent in the universe. And I love that concept. because for those of us who are idealistic, we grow up thinking we can change the world. And as you grow up, you learn the world's a pretty big place. And changing that is a pretty complicated and pretty formidable task. But what I love about Steve Jobs' quote is it's not about changing the world. It's about finding one spot, drawing a little X on it, picking up a crowbar, and putting a dent in the universe. And what I love about that concept is that if each one of us puts a dent in the universe, then you change the world. Years later, I had the opportunity to meet with Mrs. Jobs, his widow, Lorraine Powell Jobs, who does extraordinary work in all sorts of ways. And I told her about how much her husband's quote had meant to me. And she sort of smiled and she said, well, Dan, I have to tell you, I think Steve would be very flattered. But I don't think that's what he meant by it at all. But at least for our purposes, if we think about each of our own individual piece of work as part of a collective effort, that is how we make a difference. And that is how we change the world. So I hope you'll join me in thanking Joe and Zoe and Anahita, not just for being here with us this afternoon, but for the extraordinarily important work they do each and every single day. Thank you so, so much. Thanks so much to the team here at the museum, led by the incomparable Jen Maxey, who runs our programming and communications. It was absolutely extraordinary. Thank you for making this work today, Jen. We really appreciate it.
And everyone, thank Dan Schnur.
And most importantly, thanks to all of you, because being part of conversations like this is the first step toward putting a dent in the universe and to changing the world. Thanks so much for being here.